Right. Let me also make sure to mention to you guys up front, while I remember it, that we definitely have plans to offer seminars also the following semester. The average turnout for the seminars has been really good. We've had healthy interest and some super interesting seminars. So our plan is to work a little bit more on the program and then send it out to you guys before the summer vacation, so you can all enter it into your calendars. So it's time to welcome properly my colleague Gunnar Liestøl, who we knew early on when we started these seminars that we wanted to have here to discuss and to talk to us. Because when it comes to combining a research perspective with the, so to speak, the perspective of experience, Gunnar brings a long-standing and particular background and competence, since he has, for most of his career, I believe, worked on various kinds of simulations, what he and his colleagues called situated simulations, which are digital overlays and versions of physical realities, and he will address that more himself. What interests us, of course, is that building these simulations are at one and the same time based on research experience and on academic insights, but also on practice, on actually making stuff and reflecting on the process of making stuff as you're doing it. Without much further ado, and in order also to give you guys some examples and make what this is about more concrete, I give the floor to Gunnar Liestøl. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Espen, for the introduction, and also thank you to this seminar for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure to be asked in this way because of this rather peculiar approach to media studies. At least it has been a bit atypical, and it's interesting to see that it has relevance to what other people are doing as well. I will practically divide my talk into two. I will first give you a background where we will talk about some personal experiences that has sort of constrained my academic work for the past 25 years. And so then I'm going to go through some methodological choices, a few theoretical perspectives, and then I'm going to be more practical and example oriented. So then we will turn to the slides, and I will give you some more concrete examples of how this process is conducted, how this method that we're trying to develop is practiced. So to the anecdote, when I started in the early 1990s as a research fellow with scholarship from the Norwegian Research Council, I was planning to do rhetorical and narrative analysis of hypermedia text. Hypermedia was the buzzword at that time. Remember, this was 1 year before Tim Berners-Lee for the first time publicly demoed the World Wide Web, and it was maybe 5 years before it became popular or known in the public. And at that time, but still there was quite a lot of hype around hypermedia, multimedia, and all the new opportunities that digitization made possible. So I found this extremely interesting and wanted to see how my background in literary theory, general and comparative literature, could be applied to this new type of texts. And starting my scholarship, I soon experienced that the hype was a hype. Not that the technology wasn't promising, but the texts I have read about and wanted to analyze didn't actually yet exist. And that was a huge problem, because I couldn't just with 3 years, a 3-year grant, just sit and wait 3 years for the text to arrive, for the development to move on. And I had to, this caused a deep, I wouldn't say a deep personal problem, but a deep personal academic problem, because it was very contrary to the way I was trained in the humanities. And as we all know, in the humanities, we traditionally relate in our analytical capacity to already existing objects that somebody else or something else produce. Whether it's a painting, a novel, a movie, or history itself. So the humanities is, and this became extremely clear to me, how post factum, after the event, and analytically oriented the humanistic disciplines were. And I had to sort of get out of this position. I had to get out of, to say it ironically, to the position of humanities as a form of hindsight, a rear view perspective on the development and on culture. So this, I needed to think differently. How can I get to? There were of course different waves of reorienting my project, but I was still interested in the potential of digital texts, and I honestly believe that the perspective that I had designed for my project was still relevant, although the texts didn't exist. Because at that time, what you could experience or get access to of hypertext or hypermedia structure, and when we talk about hypermedia, then it's a mix of hypertext and multimodal and or multimediality. And you know, the capacity of the computing power wasn't really there, and there existed some what they called interactive videos, you know, training for security in the North Sea platforms and things like that. Not very exciting texts to really see if narrative theory had any bearings and were relevant to that type of rather simple compositions. So what came out of this thing was that I had to reorient my approach to objects. And of course, I then thought that, okay, if I can't find the text I need to analyze, and if really nobody else has already done it, I need to try to do it myself. And that, of course, was atypical and strange position to be in. It causes some problems to think that how can I be critical of something I produce myself? That's one problem. Another problem, very obvious one, was what kind of methodology should I use to really be able to conduct this kind of activity? Because this was the way I saw it. It was an attempt to move away from analysis only to a combination of synthesis and analysis, away from reflection to a combination of reflection and what we may call preflection, and also an orientation away from just poetics to poiesis. So I needed to find some kind of methodology that could guide me in this process of creating my own objects for analysis. And with the knowledge I had, I quickly turned to rhetoric, because that was already part of my toolbox in the project that I had designed. But of course, it was not in the analytical capacity, it was in the synthetical capacity. So I started focusing on the inventio part, the productive part of rhetoric. At that time, I was also lucky to, just by coincidence, come across the work by Richard McKeon. He's an American philosopher, born 1900, died 1985, trained at Columbia and worked most of his life at the University of Chicago. Not very well known. He's better known for his students, which includes Susan Sontag, Richard Rorty, Wayne Booth, Richard Buchanan, and others. So he had this notion as a philosopher and about rhetoric, that rhetoric was much, much more than just a linguistic art. He had written a very interesting work on rhetoric in the Middle Ages. We tried to follow the development of rhetoric, not just the lists and the guidebooks to speaking properly or writing eloquently, but he explored how the rhetorical method had been applied to other disciplines, and how this also developed further into the Renaissance, where the rhetorical method was applied in architecture, music, painting, and so on. So he had this approach to rhetoric as an extended, generalized rhetoric. So it was no longer just a question of designing with verbal material, although that's of course important, and thinking about rhetoric as the practice of design with verbal material is absolutely relevant, but it's more that you can apply the rhetorical methodology, and especially the topics, in a lot of other situations and disciplines and materials. So McKeon was a great inspiration. I must also note that the personal aspect of this reorientation, I also found some relevance in a book I had recently read by Gregory Ulmer called Teletheory. I think it was published first in the late 80s. It has subtitle, I think, was Grammatology in the Age of Video. And he had this particular focus, which I think is relevant to this workshop or seminar. He had a particular focus on the role of the personal experience in academic invention. And he called that, he created that as a new genre he called my story. So I think the story I've told now is actually a my story, according to the original understanding of Ulmer. How a sudden, maybe accidental experience shapes your future academic orientation. I know that this approach of Ulmer has developed into something very different, more specialized later on in more recent books. But it's I just wanted to mention it as a relevant type of literature. So, with the understanding provided by McKeon, I then had a toolbox to continue working with the design of digital texts that I could use in my rhetorical and narrative analysis. And I absolutely wanted to avoid going into although I tried to orient myself towards computer science, especially system design, which is a very strong subdiscipline at the University of Oslo, and also into human-computer interaction and other type more traditionally design-oriented disciplines. But none of these had the humanistic approach to texts, genres, convention, and meaning making, because it was much more focused on interface, the use of digital systems in organizations, programming methodology, and so on, feedback from users. Nothing that really allowed for the huge field of competence and knowledge which the humanities represent, and which, as I see it, of course, has a huge potential if we are able to make it available to the digital development. If it's possible to inform the development with this these humanities approaches, theories, concepts, conventions, understandings, perspective, anything. So I will soon go over to talk more concretely about topics that has been explored in the design, but this attempt to reorient rhetorical method, especially inventio and the topics, inspired by McKeon. It can be described that in traditional rhetorics, you use inventio and the invention, the art of invention and the topics as a way of finding the available arguments when you are constructing a presentation within an existing genre. But with the type of extension or reorientation of the rhetorical method, I have been more occupied with using the art of invention and the topics as a way of finding the elements, the devices, the techniques for future potential digital genres based on specific digital platforms. So that's the connection between traditional verbal rhetoric and the extended rhetoric, which is of course multimodal and in a certain sense without limits, because it's about project, it's about making, it's about projection, it's about innovation in general. It's a rhetoric sort of touches upon something very, very general. So, two more concrete topoi or topics. I just want to add another anecdote. While I was a student, I had the great pleasure of being a field archaeologist. Something that's been, yeah, very, very, very interesting and very, very, in many, many ways, have shaped my more recent interests and orientations, and an activity from which I've learned a lot. Being a field archaeologist, you, for instance, survey a landscape to see if you can find somewhere someone is going to build a new road, a new house, building. You survey this landscape to see if you can find any artifacts, structures that's worth excavating, and so on. In this activity, you have to train your judgment. You have to train your judgment in distinguishing between nature and culture. You have to see if something, a shape, a formation, is caused by natural processes or by cultural intervention. It's a very interesting activity. And then when you're lucky, when you find something, this is something I just found very recently. I was out in a field, test flying a drone, and in the newly plowed field, it had just been raining, which facilitates the ideal situation for finding archaeological artifacts. So this is a piece of flint. Oops. This is a piece of flint. It's not natural. It's been chopped by someone maybe 4, 5, 6,000 years ago. And I, based on the experience and the judgment that I have developed, can see that this is also a tool. It's been cut from this side so that it has created this flat piece, and then this piece again has been retouched to create an edge on this side. And then it has been used, for instance, to clean animal skin on the inside, like this, because it's a very sharp edge and you have actually something to hold it. This is I know I'm not convincing you that this is a really obvious tool. So I have another piece here that has the same function. This is actually a Neolithic stone axe from Denmark, where you have millions of them. So that's why I have one lying around. But this has actually been found. This was dropped by a human being 5,000 years ago, and nobody has touched it until I picked it up recently. This relates to a relationship that very frequently appears in topic lists. For instance, in Aristotle's Topica, in Cicero's Topica too. Very different treatises, but they both have topic lists. And that's, of course, context that the rhetorician can use and put his case inside and or in touch with to see if the mix generates some new perspectives or arguments. And the topic that's related to this piece is the part-whole relationship. We could say from a linguistic point of view and adapting, all of you know the concept of metonymy, where a part or an attribute to maybe a subject or a substance is represents the whole as a part linguistically. I'm not talking about the linguistic sense here because I'm using it in a more material sense, but this little piece is a part of a whole, of a past whole, because it was shaped by and it was used in a very specific context in the hunter-gatherer Stone Age activity in Norway, probably I would say between Neolithic or Mesolithic period, because it was found on at about 40 or 50 meters. So this little piece gives me a lot of information about a whole that is the situation from which it originates. And this is something, this is a relationship that I have been thinking a lot about, and my background in archaeology, as a field archaeology, because I'm not an academic archaeologist. I don't have archaeology as a subject or discipline. But it has followed me, and it's probably the reason why most of the simulations, the augmented reality simulation that we have created, is within the field of archaeology and cultural heritage, and it is a relationship between the present and the past context, and it's very often about reconstruction and simulation. So I think you can still see my screen.
Yeah.
It's just white.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to show you an example. This is from a project we did 6 years ago, but which we still are, which we are returning to now and working on an extension of. So I'm going to show you a short movie about the system in use, and it has an example that we then will return to, which is related to this type of relationship. And since we have some problems with Keynote not updating itself when shared on Zoom, I will play it just from the edit mode, if that's okay.
On Crete's west coast, enclosed by steep rocky cliffs, is the archaeological site of ancient Falasana. The city of Falasana was built as a fortified harbor in the 4th century BC as part of a plan to prevent Alexander the Great's empire from further expansion. Continued excavations have revealed fascinating chapters from the city's dramatic history. Today, the ruins and remains of this unique ancient port are on dry land and difficult to understand for the untrained eye. However, now it is possible to experience the rise and fall of ancient Falasana on location by means of the Falasana app. The Falasana simulation employs a quasi-mixed reality solution, where today's real environment is represented on the screen as a 3D model based on photogrammetry. This makes it easier to explain current remains and add virtual reconstructions.
The tower would have been over 20 meters tall and stood out as a landmark in ancient times.
When using the app, visitors can also explore the harbor as it may have looked in 330 BC.
Falasana was left with a magnificent military port.
Study particular artifacts in close-up and detailed view.
The letters FA and pictures of a trident and the head of a goddess.
Witness the Roman attack of Phalasana in 69 BC.
A Roman army attacked Phalasana and destroyed it. They used siege engines, which threw round stones from hundreds of meters away to destroy buildings. More than 30 catapult stones have been found. This stone has the Roman inscription XX, indicating that it weighed 20 pounds.
And consult map view for easy navigation.
So here you can see you also got some background of how the platform that we have been developing over the past 10 years actually works, because you can see how it works in the terrain. So to just describe it very quickly, there's a congruency between the physical perspective of the visitor or the user of the application and the virtual camera inside the reconstructed digital environment. Of course, we have, based on a lot of experience and testing, we have sort of made new functions where we can detach this congruity between the two perspectives to achieve special effects and so on. But it's a full screen on the device. And you compare the information on the screen with the real perspective. So this is it's like this, which we originally called situated simulation, as Espen said in introduction, has later on been identified as indirect augmented reality, because it has the mix between the virtual environment and the real environment, not on the screen itself where the real is represented by a video feed, but between what happens on the screen and what happens outside the screen. So that's the mixing. But it turns out that the congruency between the two perspectives, although they're not matching in the same way as a mixed reality version of AR, there's no obstacle mentally for combining these two. We have been reminded about that again and again and again during the testing. But back to the relationship between part and whole and this kind of more material understanding or adaptation of the metonymy. You notice in the video that we have the catapult stones. Elpida Hadidaki, the archaeologist that's excavating this site, she has found almost 50 catapult stones inside the harbor area or inside the walls of this ancient city, which is very well preserved. And we know from the classic texts at least 3 or 4 places where Phalasana is mentioned, and we know that Metellus Creticus in 69 BC conquered Crete. That's why he's called Metellus Creticus. And it was either destroyed, Phalasana was either destroyed by Metellus Creticus in 69, or if not, it was destroyed by Magnus Pompeius in 67 BC when he was given proconsular power to get rid of all the piracy in the Mediterranean, because at that time Phalasana had most certainly sort of deteriorated, or a kind of decadence that had turned them from being a very prosperous city to become a pirate haven. But what we wanted to try in this application was to see how can we really implement this feeling of having experienced the relationship between the part from the past and see how that can be related to the original context and made that past available to the present. So we reconstructed one of the catapult stones, the one with 2 X's that indicates its weight, which was of course important for the Romans when they wanted to know how far what they wanted to hit. And as you get this information, as you saw an example of, you also at the end of that voiceover, you are asked if you want to see, to get or to be invited in to see a reconstruction of why this, or maybe how this catapult stone happened to be positioned in this place, where it was actually found by the archaeologists. So then as you do that, you move back in time, and from this position that the visitor is actually standing, you move in the ballistical route of the stone and back to the field outside the walls of the city, where most probably the Metellus Creticus soldiers were approaching and positioned with their weapons and wartime or military machinery. And then you're thrown back again with from the barista, the technology that's used to throw catapult stones. Just as a quick digression, that way of moving continually from the present position of the stone when it was found to the possible origin or place from where it was thrown was inspired by Münchhausen. Some of you may remember Münchhausen's story of how he put himself on his own forces' cannonball and traveled with it to see the enemy lines and the enemy positions. And when he see it enough, he just jumped over to one of the enemy's cannonballs and came back again. So that was but this idea was not, and that's the point, this idea was not made through a systematic use of the topics. This was pure intuition and association. And that's an interesting balance. So this is an example of using the topic of part whole, and we may call it a metonymic relation, to connect this piece, this evidence, to its possible origin, to the whole in which it probably originated. We have talked now about part whole in the sense of metonymy, but we could also talk about part whole in the sense of synecdoche. In the synecdoche, the part can represent the whole, but also vice versa. The whole can represent the part. And that's interesting in this context, because the incident that we're reconstructing here is very condensed in time and space. It's only a question of a few hundred meters. It's the same activity. It's the same battle, probably a siege situation where the Romans occupy the area around the city and just destroys it. So then to our contemporary extension of this application, where we actually want to not just tell the story of antiquity at Phalasana and this and the rise and fall of this antique town or city, polis, but also of the place itself, because nearby there's a wreck. You can see here this shadow underwater. This is a World War II wreck, and I'm part of the EU project now that relates to the use of AR or digital technology in marine archaeology. So we are making an extension from the timeline in this application about Phalasana. So it's not just 330 BC, 69 BC and present, but it's in addition 1941. In 1941, in May 1941, Crete and the rest of Greece was occupied, invaded by German and Italian, but primarily German forces. And in late May, Germany also invaded Crete. This forced the British, Australian, New Zealand, and the Greek forces to withdraw from the island. And as part of that, there was a ship, the wreck that we saw, a landing craft tank, actually a secret ship because it had just been released in Britain based on Churchill's ideas. This ship was on its way from Suda Bay near Hania, going west on the 27th of May during the night, because during the day it couldn't sail because of the Luftwaffe. And it was carrying, in addition to crew, a platoon of New Zealand soldiers. And in the early morning, they found that this is a good harbor, and of course it was, because it had been a harbor since antiquity. And they wanted to stay there for the day, and then travel further to Sfakia the next night, so that they could help with the evacuation. Okay, I must not go too much detail in. How am I with time, Espen?
Let's say you round off in the course of 5 minutes.
Yeah. So the question of part hold in this case is that when we are looking at the situation, that's the reconstruction of this ship, we need to put into the context the situation of the Battle of Crete, or the bigger context, the situation of World War II at that time, and so on. And what's interesting here for me is to see how can the digital technology make good relationship between parts and wholes in this context. So that's why we're now exploring how to use the virtual camera to include large contexts in which you can orient yourself. We're embarking on a project now, an EAA grant with Portugal, where we're going to do the same with the Napoleonic Wars related to Fort Paimago, north of Paimago, north of Lisbon. And again, this is a huge war, actually a world war, but this is a small operation, a much smaller theater of war, but still very complex. And again, the synecdoche is a solution to be able to communicate that part of the war from different positions, because then if you're located one place, you can have this as a part and have access to the whole, but the other parts of the whole, if you're positioned there, could also be accessed through the whole. And then you make this almost symmetric oscillation between part and whole, depending on which place you're positioned in. And we also got some funding for a pre-project doing the same with the Battle of Narvik, because then we will have access to 3D models that they are creating in relation to the new feature film they're making. The structure of this application, at this extension at Falasana, is also related to another topos, which again is adaptation or analogy, because when we do the reconstruction, we're using the traditional documentary film mode as an introduction to provide information about the context. And then this introduction or linear sequence with clips from World War II real footage is turned into an AR documentary, which is the potential genre that we're trying to explore and suggest conventions and devices for. And then you can experience the reconstruction of the event where this ship was bombed and destroyed by German Stuka bombers, and at the same time access background information to enrich the experience of this narrative. It also includes a dry dive, which is again what I mentioned earlier, a way to detach the virtual camera from the physical position to explore the environment around yourself, so that you can send the virtual camera in to underwater positions and do, for example, simulations of, or explain, describe, reconstruct parts of the wreck. And here, I just wanted to show you this because these are the thing I'm working on 12 hours a day now. It's to put this thing together so that we can test it in 4 weeks' time, hopefully on Crete, so that again my students can finish their assignment before 1st of July. Time is short, so I will just a lot of information about. This is also a type of media archaeology because we need to study aerial photography. For instance, here's from 1986, where you can see the condition of the wreck here. It's much more is still in place compared to what this looks like today. And this is also an aerial photo from 1945, where you can see that basically the whole ship, except where the Stuka bomb, 500 kilo Stuka bomb, was actually made, blasted and sunk the ship. Here's one of the models, the model of the ship, reconstructed, and here placed in the 3D model that's generated from drone photography. This is only a mock-up, and water isn't added, the rest of the environment isn't added, and so on. The same ship with the camouflage net. An example from, which again is a part-whole relationship, where one of my students has reconstructed the mechanism that makes the ramp go down. So this is a landing craft, right? So you have to take the ramp down, and then so that the tanks can disembark, or a troop of soldiers can disembark. So he's reconstructing, showing what this mechanism looks like today on the wreck and how it actually functions. So here we have a partial reconstruction, similar to the partial reconstruction that you saw with the circular tower in the video. One last example. I think I'm skipping the other example, Espen, because of the time.
Right.
This is a manuscript or a, for a plan for the reconstruction. The reconstruction, the actual event is about 5-6 hours. We're going to compress it to 5 minutes. So it starts with clips, real footage, then read, and the point is that you, of course, will get this experience of being close to the real events when you see the real footage. Then we continue in black and white with footage that we generate based on the 3D models and the 3D model of the sea, so that we can get from the general footage to the specific footage that we create. Remember, the actual user is now on the site. Here, looking at the movie, the general information of the Battle of Crete, but the information in the movie, it's getting closer to this position and the event they are actually about to see the reconstruction of. And then the traditional documentary mode goes into AR mode, which is noticed by the user because suddenly they're holding the camera. So they decide how to move the camera, how to orient it, because they're now actually standing next to the wreck. So what I've been struggling with now, which is a typical practical design challenge, is should I use past tense or present tense in the voiceover? Because we're going to use the voiceover all the way through this reconstruction, not just for the traditional documentary part, but also for the AR documentary part, to keep it as a narrative flow. But remember then that it's possible to leave this sequence to go into the background information and then back again, so that you can enrich the experience. So in this version, I've suggested that we go to present tense when we start with a particular information that's related to this time and this place, and then continue with that all the way. I'm not sure if that's the right thing to do, because we are still, and of course every user is still aware of the fact that they're in 2021 and not 80 years back in 1941. So whether it's smart or a good design decision to use present tense, I don't know. It has to be, again, experienced on location, and not only by people involved in the design process and the decision that's been made, but also by people who accidentally are visiting and will get the offer to use it, or maybe later on download the published app. So I hope this provided some kind of a brief look into my world from the reorientation in the early 90s to the continued development of this methodology. So the whole point with the methodological development is to see to what extent it's possible to create, I wouldn't call it a method, but more a technique in which it's easier to find, to paraphrase Aristotle, to find the available means for efficient representation and dissemination using this technology in such contexts.
All right, wonderful stuff. Thank you very much, Gunnar. I think I'll take the privilege of being chair to start us off with just a couple of questions. When I hear you talk and see those illustrative videos that you and your colleagues have made for many of these simulations, I'm always curious as to what it actually feels like to just hold that mobile phone and see through it and experience the contrast between seeing a real present and a simulated past. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about just, this is what they ask in sports broadcasts. What does it feel like? I mean, what kind of a quality of personal and bodily and sensory experience is this really?
And also remember, then they use present tense when they answer.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good question, because it's always a surprise.
Yeah.
Because you never create, although I visited this place before, or also always, surveyed the site, because the master topos is this place, the place itself. So although you are familiar with the place, this place becomes something else when you're distanced from it and plan the work, plan the design. And then when you come and use it, it's always different, but also in a good way. But it's and this also explains, you know, the uniqueness of the mixing of the real and the virtual. The fact that the real environment, and that's of course what you try to enrich and try to provide some kind of aura for. It's always different from what you are able to imagine, and this is the same impression that we get from the testing. We always test this and get some evaluation with this application with in this case visitors on site, that we just ask, are you willing to spend half an hour to test this application, and then answer a questionnaire. It's always because it's still a fresh technology, few people have similar experiences, so it's also always a new feeling, always a new experience for the people who use it, and 99% it's always a positive experience.
Right.
So yeah, but it's also unique. It also has this uniqueness of here and now, which of course is important in the aura discussion of Benjamin, for instance.
Right. I couldn't help when I looked at your YouTube video demonstrations. I mean, you guys have really done a lot of work over a lot of years. And what I notice is that the digital simulations that you and your partners and colleagues made 10 years ago or more were more about showing scenes and environments of the past that become available through the simulation. And it seems that like in later years, you've added more action. You've added the narration of events. And what you see through the screen comes to resemble a bit more the gameplay of a game, for instance. So that you're now recreating not just historical environments, but you're also narrating history in a way. Do you consider yourself as a kind of a historian now? So that in principle, you are producing a version and an interpretation of a historical event that in at least some cases are similar to what the historian would do by traditional means, but you have now added the digital means of being really a historian.
Well, the primary purpose is not to be an historian. Of course, that's extremely important, but I always, at least up to now, in most of the cases, I have had the good fortune of working with the scholars that are the experts on the topic or the place that we are creating the simulation for. So in this case, it's the archaeologist for the antiquity part, and there is a historian archaeologist for the World War II part. So I still have my focus is still on the form of expression,
right,
of the inventive use of rhetorical and narrative devices.
Okay. And
the further development and harnessing of the method and.
Right. Thank you. I think we'll turn it over to the other participants here. So please raise your virtual hands if you have a question, like Tim has now done. So please, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Gunnar, for such a wonderful presentation. That was just marvelous. I mean, I don't think I've had the pleasure to see much of your work so far. And this was really, I mean, this was just wonderful, especially as someone who studied history, which was my original field. This was really a joy. And I want to sort of, I guess, I have a couple of questions / I don't know if they're thoughts, but they will end, I'm guessing, in a question. And they relate very much to what Espen said. First of all, that sports analogy, which I think is interesting in a sense that when it comes to the sports analogy.
Yeah.
Which, of course, when, especially in football, when players look back on the match, they seem to effortlessly jump between different temporal tenses, right? So they will say, we played very well when they talk about a sort of a generalized, or you could say a collective effort, but also I'm guessing when they're talking about a mood rather than an emotion, so sort of a general, in Noah Carroll's sense, right? Sort of a generalized sense rather than a punctuated moment. But then when they will talk about something that happened specifically to them, for example, the goalkeeper saying, I see him coming and I know he's going to the left, then they'll talk in the present tense. And so it's quite interesting that in terms of the sports analogy, it is very much a relationship between, I guess, the particular and the whole, or the moment and also the individual and the general. So I was just thinking that's quite interesting in terms of your question about which tense to use where. And I would agree that your idea is probably the best one. And I was thinking secondly here about some of the stuff that Gry has been researching when it comes to those social media representations and accounts of the experience, for example, of the Holocaust, like the Instagram story, Eva Stories, that Gry has worked on, where we follow a girl, her diary entries, and we follow her day by day. She posts something every day in a present tense, stuff that is happening, but that was, of course, happening years ago. And I know that the Anne Frank Foundation, I think, is doing something similar. Maybe ZDF has even already done something where passages from Anne Frank's diary are sort of literally translated to the present moment and put on Instagram as something that is happening now. So again, it's that sort of the present tense, or that presentism, as our good friend Zoltan probably would say. And that brings me to my question here, I guess, which is not so much about history, but about historicity. Because I'm wondering whether your distinct use, whether your distinct methodology, whether that has implications, not just for the telling of history, but the historicity behind it, the sort of the temporal logic and the way in which we relate to the past, and whether in that sort of mixing and matching of different temporal tenses, if that's something that is changing or that is different from how we might approach that when we write about it, for example, in a history book. So that was my last question. And here I was thinking a lot, which I'm sure none of you knows. In Holland, there's a very famous comic book series, it's a children's comic book series. Actually, I might even have it, I think, because I've saved it for my kids. And it's called From Zero Till Now. And it's a comic book story about a boy who meets an old guy, and they sort of go through history together. There's multiple parts, which is also always, it starts out in the past tense. And then, of course, the moment the individualized experiences that they're going through happen, it moves to the present tense. Anyway, but my question is about historicity. Does it make sense?
It makes sense, but actually I'm asking myself the same question. So again, I can't answer you now. I will have to see how it works, because this is the first time we're doing these changes and actually testing this out. It's I'm curious to know what the effect will actually be if you, through the present tense of, for instance, the voiceover, if you bring yourself, or the user brings he or she closer to the event, or if the event, the presence of the past event, is brought closer to the user. I don't know.
I'm also guessing in that sense of rhythm, right? In the same way that I guess that that someone, and Jameson says, that the end of history isn't about time, it's about space. In this sense, strangely, this doesn't seem to be about space as much as it seems about rhythms or something, right? Because especially, sort of when the camera sort of departs, right, and we go into those, those are, it seems to me, rhythmic decisions, right? So you're creating a rhythm out of history, right? Here's the blast, here is this. And so I'm just also wondering about some of those choices in terms of the rhythm that you create of that historical narration, which is a different type of, is rhythmicalization a word? Rhythmicalization than you might have, in writings. Yeah.
Yeah. Both the problem and the potential here is, of course, that the conventions aren't formed. So you have the repertoire that you have of devices that you can use, or that hasn't become conventions yet, is legio. You could use anything, and if you're referring to that so-called dry dive around the wreck. That was done on intention to have a fixed route around the wreck with stops you had to go by, because it's a simpler way of telling the story than opening up for a free swim around. While in the older part of the application, you're free to walk between the different parts of the site and activate different simulations or different parts, different information about parts of the site. And you are also all the way free to use the timeline, to just move in time, independent of whether you are actually moving in space. So we're of course employing the whole register of the user-driven mode. But at the same time, we're trying to have some control, because when you're doing this type of dissemination or this type of storytelling, the only thing you still have are beginnings. And beginnings are also often related to entrances. That's a spatial equivalent. So for instance, here it's a gate that you have to go through. So we know that this is where you start. And that's give you a little bit of dramaturgical control. But when it comes to the wreck and the dry dive and the reconstruction of the incident that led to the wreck, you had to walk a path. That's almost the only way you can get there. And then we're going to provide voiceover that's positioned, so that as you walk, you start with general background information, but as you get closer, you are more specific about the information, so that you can prepare the user for this experience in the best way. And this is, of course, an analogy to cutscenes in computer games, or the introductory linear sequence of many adventure games. You take advantage of that linear sequential mode to inform the user as much as possible, so that they are better equipped in the more user-driven part of the exploration. I don't think that's a good that's an answer, but the options are so many. But so you need to start with the simple things and build it from the ground up. You need to, and I think the user needs to recognize, you need to build on adaptations and analogies. That's why we're testing out this way of using the newsreel mode of storytelling in the opening of the reconstruction, to see if that can inform the user, but at the same time, and then it gives a continuous transition to the user-driven AR mode of what could potentially be a future genre of AR or location-based documentary. It's a trial and error process.
Yeah, no, thanks. I thought it was a wonderful answer. I mean, or answer, a wonderful contemplation.
I have, if nobody else wants to.
I have.
There's Tina. Yeah,
I need to run, so I just want to pose a couple of questions. Thank you so much. It was very interesting and informative, also to learn more about your own trajectory or your my story behind this. So I was just wondering, with the example that you gave with your stone, with your physical object, and thinking about parts and wholes, do you think there's a case to be made about reading, digital objects in the same way? So thinking about sort of a digital object as in, what it reveals about its heritage, about sort of where it comes from. Is there sort of an analogy to be drawn there? Even like a method to think about, an API or something like that, reading a digital object as you would do with your archaeological mindset with the actual stone.
I suppose so, but to me then it's a question of, would you use that knowledge that you possibly generate from that perspective, would you use that to understand in an analytical way a subject matter that you are analyzing for analytical purposes, or the API because you want to create something?
What difference do you think that makes?
Well, it's a different of use.
Yeah.
And but I'm sure that the part-whole oscillation, which of course is a hermeneutical perspective, is relevant in that context too.
Yeah. It was just something that struck me as sort of could be an interesting thing to explore. I was also wondering, so two more things as I was listening to you, sort of finding your way into media design and how to think about sort of generating things as part of your method or technique, or what you prefer to call it, and not sort of finding that obvious home for that sort of work when you started. How do you still think of it as sort of a lacking field, or have you seen it sort of evolve in different ways in other disciplines, even in media studies? And I'm asking partly because I think sort of going to a lot of these STS conferences, that the idea of sort of critical making and maker spaces and sort of hardware hacking and media design, it's not called media design, but sort of speculative design and all kinds of design approaches that are not explicitly HTI or computer science focused, but comes out of philosophy of technology and sociology of technology and all that, has been sort of it's always been there, but really exploded, I think, in recent years. So I was just wondering if that is something that you are oriented towards, or whether you see, how have you seen this development, and where is the space for that in perhaps more traditional media studies departments?
Yeah, I have of course noticed that there are a lot more activity going on now that can be compared with this type of approach, and in Norway, for instance, explicitly with the notion of media design, which I think Lars Nyre introduced maybe 10 years ago or something, and Anders Fagerjord has been doing things inside it. So so there's actually quite a lot of activity at the Media City section of the media department in Bergen, which is quite interesting. And also a lot of the more separated disciplines earlier is now converging due to many things, because the threshold of approaching, you know, design and programming and the capacity of the computers and everything is getting simpler and simpler, more and more common. But at the same time, I haven't done any attempt in trying to map the field. I have too many questions on my own that I want to get answers to, and as long as that doesn't hurt my approach, I'm primarily going to pursue the track that I'm on, or the line that I'm on. But
yeah,
definitely,
it seems you found your thing a long time ago.
I mean, I have, and especially this also becomes natural because we have developed a platform, which is code. So we have which is has also been converted into a plugin for Unity. So it's actually an editor that's available for free with some of the basic features. But to me, that platform is a lab in which we can just continue and continue to explore the software functionality and to see how this can support the more meaningware level of conventions and devices, and you know, the rhetorical.
Yeah, which actually, I mean, this leads me to my final question. Who is the we? I mean, it seems you have a lot of collaborations, and I know that you're working a lot with students, and that you've managed to set up a working a form of working that includes a lot of students. So really great at recruiting more maker-oriented way of even like media production in a way, right? So of including students. But who are your collaborators? Excuse me if I'm mistaken about this, but you know, going back to sort of your personal or to your story as an academic, from the outside, my impression is that you do very much your thing within the department, and but you're quite sort of alone in doing exactly what you are doing within the department framework, and that you have found collaborators here and there. But are those also, you know, do they share exactly your rhetorical approach? Are they from sort of the humanities coming with it? You know, it's quite unique, this humanistic way of working in such an applied scale when it comes to AR. Or is it very interdisciplinary, and how do you navigate that as sort of for so many years in sort of an academic home, but being so much oriented towards sort of having to work with other people besides people next to your offices?
Well, it is actually both. For instance, the new project with Portugal is Terje is included because of the user studies. So there is connections. But the team that I'm basically involved in are programmers and 3D developers, which from time to time also include my students. As you said, now, for instance, the one we're doing, which I gave you some details about here, that's also a student project. Unfortunately, they cannot join me in testing it out in June. I'm not even sure if I'm able to do it myself. But when it comes to the humanities approach to this type of design in academic settings, I have some some colleagues and a small network of people involving Jay Bolter at Georgia Tech and Maria Engberg at Malmö University. So there are some, but it's not a huge network, or we're not trying to make a discipline or anything. We're not trying to institutionalize anything. It's actually still a bottom-up approach, going where it makes sense. Yeah, I think that's the best answer I can give.
Great. There's a question from Donna Persol. I hope I'm getting your name at least half right.
That was perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think this is really fascinating, really interesting work. My background is very different, and so I it's made me very enthusiastic, but I'm not sure how it helps you. But I come from an education background, mostly with school level children, and also cultural studies. And what I think could be so interesting about this is you have this potential to tell stories from different perspectives at the same time. And so you were talking about, like, how do we give this a voice? Whose voice should be telling this story? And I just wonder how much potential is there for actually telling both sides of a battle, or people from different cultures experiencing this same moment in time, to offer that plethora of voices in history, because you have that moment there, but then you also have the potential to make it real stories. And I just wonder, where is that? I'm really not technological at all, but I just wonder whether that's possible.
That's absolutely possible, and it can be done in different ways. For instance, in archaeology, there's a lot of discussion about reconstructions of buildings, and of course also activities and actions and events. But we haven't tried actually that out, where you have different interpretations of reconstructions, so that you can provide an alternative reconstruction based on the information that's available. So that's one example. Another example is, as you mentioned, with battlegrounds or battles, is to have both sides. We made 4 years ago now a simulation from Omaha Beach on D-Day, and the documentation and the resources you have is also very good on the German side. But it was the first version is primarily focused on the activity of the Americans. In fact, there isn't one German present in in the simulation. But that's the next step. Yeah, is to have the German present in the simulation. And it's an interesting thing, because you're forced to choose side in a topographical way. Because when you get to Omaha Beach as a tourist, you never approach from the sea like the Americans did. You always approach from the land side. So you're in the German position, and you can't avoid it. Yeah. And that's when we're going to, create the inventory, all the people that's in this area, that is actually the strongest German position on that beach. And I have, enormous amount of information about it. And 2 of the German soldiers have written their self-autobiography describing their experience. So that's something that's really high on the agenda, to really explore that kind of switching between the positions.
That's great to hear, because I think particularly coming from working with students, where you're trying to get them to understand there's many sides, there's not just one book. this kind of thing, which really can show both perspectives, could be really engaging. So brilliant. Thanks so much.
When I see the video illustrations in your lecture and also others that are on YouTube, I was reminded of a book I read quite recently about panoramas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which were great big paintings with lighting and in specially made rooms and buildings, and also props in front, you know, to really maximize the illusion, typically of historical scenes and battles and exotic locations. And the discussions around those panoramas were really, really interesting. I just thought I'd mention a couple of things that were discussed and just ask whether, you know, whether there are parallels or whether there are not. One discussion of, you know, discussions were starting from this wow factor, this immersive, this illusionistic quality of the thing, giving you the sort of kick of, wow, it's as if I was there at that time, you know, that illusionistic sensory kick. People were very fascinated by it and discussed it a lot. And the perceived upside of it at the time was that it brought you, it was a key to really unlocking, you know, the secrets of history, because you could actually see what it was like when it happened. It was an argument about presence, that the medium just afforded you a privileged presence. The downside, which was discussed at the time, was that the illusions tended to disappoint over time. They wore off, so that after, you know, disappointingly short time, the kick that led you into presence didn't deliver the way it used to. So that there was a kind of a disillusionment building over time. Does this rhyme at all with the medium and the kinds of discussions and considerations that you are engaging with these simulations?
Absolutely. And I once visited with Jay Bolter in Atlanta, the big, I think it's called a diorama, when it's the big diorama about the Battle of Atlanta, which is about, I think it's 100 years old, and it's still there.
That's a famous one.
Yeah, and it has a rotating, so that the audience is in the middle and it's rotating. And then so it's a story sequence, so you go from scene to scene. And it has this fascinating transition from the 3D objects in the foreground, and the seamless transition to the background, which is done, you know, in the same way as you see in you see these dioramas from museums of natural history. For instance, in New York, they have some wonderful sceneries. So I think that's really. I think there could be a lot to learn from that tradition, and especially when you do comparative analysis between that way of dissemination and other forms of dissemination, including the one we'll be talking about now. And it's also, of course, interesting that the newness fades and the interest sort of decreases. And that's, of course, happens with the digital solutions all the time. But the thing is that the speed of change is so fast in the digital development that they're always, you're fed with new possibilities, increased power, better graphics. So it hasn't reached this mature, you know, plane in the development. And that's where we really get the test of time, and to see if the conventions and devices that's developed really will work, because now it has this newness.
Yeah.
And that's maybe the danger of it, is that the newness is the main quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's also, I think there's also if you remember, we went with the department to Berlin.
Yeah.
There was a modern diorama at one of the peninsula.
At the Museumsinsel, yeah.
Yeah, they had one Pergamon, I think,
yeah,
which was based on the huge Photoshop work, where you can walk and it's had days switching between day and night, and that was an interesting take on the storytelling aspect or the temporal sequence, yeah, compared to the Atlanta, because it used light and to advance the story. Absolutely. Or introduce the temporal aspect in a static environment.
Right. Last question or comment of the day goes to Tim.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Espen. That was the panorama argument is, I think, quite interesting. I mean, I'm also thinking here of, I'm sure you know it, which is one of Holland's most famous panoramas, Panorama Mesdag, which was painted in the late 19th century, which is still there in The Hague. It's 14 meters wide. It's all round. It's a painting that's all round in an old, I don't know if I remember this correctly, but it feels like it might be sort of a tower. And so it's round, and then they have lit it, and there's little figurines in front of it. But the painting is the real thing, and it's immensely high, and it's immensely wide. And I really recommend it. And that also, in a way, I think it was just a question if you have any ideas on it, because so far, of course, the types of history, and again, it's about historicity, I guess, the types of history that you've worked on and that you've developed these new methods and materials for are either sort of, site history, as opposed to sort of a more distributed or infrastructural history, and events, as opposed to the non-eventful history. Whereas, of course, as I'm sure we all know, some of the most important moments in history are distributed or infrastructural or not really located anywhere specifically, or are, and this goes especially, I can say, for Dutch history, are immensely non-eventful, right? I mean, I think I've said this before, one of the most famous examples of Dutch military history, which is a disaster all the way through, but is in the Second World War, when the Germans came in and the bicycle army, because the Dutch army was mostly on bicycles, tried to cycle to the border to stop the Germans, only to find out when they arrived at the sea that they'd made a logistical error and had gone the other way. Something that both the Dutch and the Germans, by the way, hid for a long time out of shame, that there had not really been a fight taking place at all. And so only when the archives were opened, they realized as much. There's some really great songs that they wrote whilst at the sea or at the wrong side of the river, and they started writing songs about what happened, which is really good. Anyways, but that's non-eventful history, right? The entire point was the absence of the event. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how, if you would continue this, whether that would be something you'd be looking into, sort of more distributed accounts and also non-eventful, how you would go about doing that, if you had any ideas about it already.
I think as Espen remarked earlier, that the simulation that we have been doing has been moving from static to dynamic environments, and that's because of the technology, that the improvements. So you sort of you try to exploit whatever is available. And of course, the non-eventful history is just as important, but this is a question of visualization. So that puts some constraints on the selection of topics. And of course, it's also, in my interest, is also very focused on place and place history and the location. But, we have also done work on which we could call non-eventful history, because we've done things on climate change in the future. So that type of simulations, which is science fiction in a way. projections into the future, the change of how, for instance, how vegetation changed according to rise in temperature, and so on. So of course, and this that in that direction, it opened up for huge amounts of applications and contexts. So I mean, it's there's so many opportunities, and you can only do one thing at a time.
All
But
right.
of course, it will of course be in general a great challenge to make the intangible tangible, which is often the role of metaphor.
All right, I
Thanks.
think we'll leave it at that, and say thank you particularly, of course, to Gunnar, and also for your contributions and questions. And so I guess, Tim, you might want to stop the recording.